Yes, so hello, you've already heard. I'm Judith. I'm a second year PhD student in Yesi's lab. And I'm going to talk about awareness of life today. Or if you're from the Netherlands or from Belgium, you might know the term tiredness of life better or have an association with that. And what I will be doing is to describe our first attempt to define this phenomenon. And besides by Jessie, I'm also supervised by Els van Wijngaarden, who's working on this topic in the Netherlands. Specifically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover three broader topics. So I first give some background information about the concept, which is also a kind of political background information. Then I will go to the main parts, so how we actually developed our definition. And then I will end similarly to Julie with some future points that still need clarification and the studies that we plan to do. So I'm going to start with the background information. Some of you also might know, not so much the term weariness of life, but the terms completed life or tiredness of life are terms that regularly appear in the Dutch and Belgian media and also in political discussions on this topic. And there, this phenomenon is defined as the experience that older adults who do not have a severe psychiatric or physical illness experience their life as completed or feel tired of life. And because of this experience, they want to be able to request euthanasia. So that is the political discussion behind this topic. However, if you look in scientific literature, the picture is much less clear. So we started to search for definitions of these terms, but couldn't really find anything, which is why we started to do a systematic review. And there we looked specifically into, if we look in the scientific literature, which kind of terms do we actually find back there and how are they defined? And we took a very broad approach. So we used the different terms that you see on the slide. So awareness of life, completed life, tiredness of life, but also life fatigue, suffering from life. So we tried to really cover a broad range of search terms, but we did not use any other criteria. So we didn't, for example, check the age of the population that was studied, or also the publication date was unimportant. And the most important findings you can see on this slide. So the terms awareness of life and tiredness of life were actually the terms that were most frequently used throughout the studies that we found. And they were also used interchangeably usually. And they were also used outside of the Netherlands and of Belgium, were used already for a long time. So I think the first study that we included was from 1972. And they were also used for various populations. So not only for older adults, but we also found, for example, studies on the general population and even some studies on young adults. And maybe the last point is even the most important point. So what we saw is that the definitions of what awareness or tiredness of life is differed depending on the context. And what I mean with context here is whether a study was conducted inside the debate surrounding euthanasia and assisted suicide, or whether it was conducted outside of this political debate. So when we looked inside, or the studies that were conducted inside this debate, we saw that the phenomenon was defined similarly to the picture that we see in the media. So there they talk about older adults specifically. They define that the experience is not caused by a psychiatric or a physical disease, and they also relate it very closely to a death wish. And then if we look outside of this debate, we see a different picture. So there, very often these terms are defined as the thought or the feeling that life is not worth living anymore. And there it's seen as kind of a first step in a suicidal process. So that a death wish is something that can develop out of this experience, but not necessarily needs to develop, so that they are basically separate phenomena. So yes, while we got some more overview about the definitions, we did still not have a very clear-cut definition that we could use in our own studies, which is why we actually started to develop a definition ourselves, so that we have a consistent definition which we can work. That's how it is, with which we can work. Yes, and we based this definition on the review that I was just talking about. Before I continue, I have a short side note on the terms that I'm using, because as you saw before, there are various terms used, and we chose for the term weariness of life because completed life is pretty culturally specific, so mostly used in the Netherlands, and it also has a very, we think, positive connotation to it, or it gives positive associations that we think do not really match the experience that people have. And I think with awareness, kind of a broader tiredness is described than only physical tiredness. So therefore, I stick to this term. Okay, but how did we actually develop the definition? We used mostly 3 sources. So we looked at which terms are used to describe this phenomenon. We looked at the definitions and the descriptions that we identified in the literature. And we also looked at the first qualitative findings that are available on this phenomenon from my co-supervisor, Elf van Wijngaarden. And also based on our review, we took 2 assumptions. So we said that the definition that we're going to develop is not specific to a high age, but we think that also this experience can develop in different ages. And the definition does not include a death wish, so that we can then in the next step test whether these actually occur. Here you see an overview of kind of what we got then. We, in the next step, after we had that overview, we grouped together similar information that we could find. So for example, in green here, you can see that yes, in the terminology already, we see that it is talked about a feeling of tiredness or of fatigue. And then in the next green part is a definition that we found in our review. And also there they talk about, among other factors, a long-lasting physical and mental tiredness, loss of energy, and a general lack of internal drive. Yes, so in this way, we continued. And then with this approach, we identified kind of 4 components that we saw were central to this experience. So the first one being boredom with life, the next one meaninglessness, then aversion towards life, and as I was already talking about, fatigue. And then in the next step, we again went to the literature to see, because these are concepts, of course, that we already know, what is already out there to help us come up with a better description of what we think awareness of life is. And what I'm going to do is to shortly go through the different components and talk about our descriptions. So the first one is boredom with life, and that is actually, most of it is based on literature on existential boredom. And based on that, we here describe boredom as, yes, maybe very clearly, experiencing life as boring, but also as a feeling of having had enough of life. So that is sometimes also described as being satiated by life or being fed up with life. And then more behaviorally, we see it as kind of a passive stance. So that people feel indifferent and uninterested in life, and also lack motivation and drive. And this passive stance is then also described to lead, for example, to the feeling that time is dragging and does not go on. The second component is aversion towards life. So aversion is something that is a form of disgust, or is described as a form of disgust. And in disgust, you kind of have a whole range of experiences. So it can also be less severe experiences, such as dislike, but it can also become very severe, such as revulsion or loathing. And in awareness of life, we actually here distinguish between experiences that concern the self and experiences that concern your life more broadly, which is based on the concept of disgust with life, and that already has been related to, for example, suicide ideation in people. And here we behaviorally see it differently. So compared to the more passive stance in boredom, we here think that it's a more active reaction of avoidance and withdrawal from the life that you lead. The third component is meaninglessness. You have already heard something about meaninglessness. Here we see it even broader. So we think that in awareness of life, you can have an intuitive sense that your life doesn't make sense and is not meaningful. But we also see that like purpose, comprehension, felt significance. You might remember from the previous presentation that this is described as the tripartite view, but it's not only on that we base ourselves on theory, but also in the table that I showed before, we saw these different components actually, just that they're not explicitly named that way. But for example, it's often talked about a negative future time perspective that people have, or that they do not have goals for their future, or as I said, that they experience their life as not worth living. So this is basically also what this view describes. And then lastly, we also included the perception that life itself is perceived as empty and meaningless. Then the last component, which is fatigue. Also here, we think that it can affect different levels. So for example, physical fatigue, that you feel bodily exhaustion or do not have the energy to do things anymore. It can also be a mental or cognitive fatigue, so that you have the feeling that your thinking is very difficult and goes very slow. But it can also be an emotional fatigue, so that you, for example, feel you actually don't have the energy anymore to connect with the people around you. And again, because we're talking about awareness of life, we think that this is because it can affect so many levels, it can become so severe that you experience actually your whole life as something that is very tiring and heavy for you. So until now, I kind of described the components as separate entities. We do not really expect that this is how it kind of looks like in real life, but we more hypothesize that these experiences will all be very intertwined. And also, if we look at the literature that already is there on these components, this is also what you see. So for example, aversion or disgust is sometimes even described as very severe boredom. And also a lack of meaning is something that many people see as inherent to feeling bored. And also fatigue is basically the same story. So also about fatigue, it is seen as sometimes being first to the experience of boredom, or even being a part of you feeling bored. So this is also what we expect in people who are wary of life, that these are very strongly intertwined. Yes, as you can already see in the title of this presentation, we think that this is really a first attempt to come to consistent definition of the phenomenon, but of course we still have many open questions about this. I'm going into some of them that regularly came up during discussions that we had. The first one is actually about these different components. So something that we often ask ourselves is, do you really need to experience all of these different components simultaneously so that we would speak of awareness of life? Because maybe some people only experience some of them, but still have a similar experience. And even before that is, of course, the question, are really these components similarly important, or are some much more central to people's experience? And we are currently in the process of developing a scale to measure awareness of life, and did an expert review of our items. And this is basically also what we see appearing there, so that some components in general get higher ratings than others. So for example, boredom is something that got, I think, the highest ratings of the components, but also within components there are differences. For example, that none of the items that we formulated about aversion towards self reached our cutoff value. And this is also something that we have already been discussing, whether awareness of life is really something that also is about how you perceive yourself, or it's more about how you perceive your life in general or the world around you. So yes, both across components and also within components, there are still some points that need to be refined. The second point you have heard a lot about already, which is the topic of deconnectedness. As Ruby said, in these first qualitative findings on completed life, so they are in the Netherlands, so completed life, we see that this topic is very central. But at this moment, we do not know, as we just discussed, is it a predictor, or is it a consequence, or is it even another constituent of awareness of life? Because we see it also coming back in, for example, existential loneliness, So yeah, we think it's important, but we at the moment don't know where to place it. And then the last question, also something that came up during our discussions and during the expert review that we did, is how we can actually differentiate this experience of awareness of life from depression. Because of course, there are clear overlaps also. For example, if you talk about meaninglessness. So yeah, that will be an important point to look at. We hope that at least some of those points we can already address in our studies. As I said, we're currently in the process of developing a scale. And then with this scale, we also want to look at what is the correlation between awareness of life and, for example, passive and active death wishes, because that was this kind of point that came back in the review, but also to see how it actually correlates with depressive symptoms. And then in the next step, we also want to use the scale in a longitudinal study so that we can see how does this experience develop over time and also co-occurs with depression, for example. And then besides that more quantitative part, we also have a qualitative part. So we started interviews with people who feel wary of life to see how they describe this experience. Yes, and by combining all these things, we hope to be able to refine our definition and also make sure that we have a concept that is also clinically useful and maps to how people experience this phenomenon. That was it. Thanks very much.
Are there any questions for you?
Sure. I'm interested when you also look at the question whether participants in your research who have any belief in afterlife and all how it will affect perhaps difficult stages at the end of earthly life.
Yeah.
Is that the fact you're looking at? Or?
Yeah, so at this moment, we're still developing the scale to measure awareness of life. So we did not see that kind of coming because we thought we would just start with our studies and then we realized we actually don't know what awareness of life actually is. But yeah, I think for some people it will probably play a role, for others not. But yeah, at this moment, we haven't planned out the longitudinal study in detail, but I guess, we will look at some measure of religious background, but I'm not sure in how far we will go into specific beliefs, let's say. Yeah, though I think what I'm wondering about is, so we look at, kind of the experience of awareness of life in the discussion, the political discussion, for example. It's also about whether people want to request euthanasia because they have this experience. So I think that also there might be differences, so that specific religious beliefs influence the experience differently than kind of wanting to take a specific action. And that is, I think, also that we see in, for example, suicide research, that these are really two different things. So I think there might be a difference of the influence of religious beliefs.
Do you have specific ideas of how that would work?
Well, I'm curious, for instance, if someone has a belief in afterlife, it actually affect how they experience or the actions they will choose, or the sense of reason they avoid it because of religious belief. Doesn't really help such a belief, or doesn't help.
Yeah, and I think it might be especially interesting to look, I mean, that is something that's also done in suicide research, but I think that also here it would be very interesting to look at this transition. If someone has this experience, like how does the person deal with it, depending on the beliefs?
I can imagine that their belief will play a role, not in the experience of the phenomenon itself, or which behavioral actions you link with it. There indeed afterlife ideas or even just religious ideas might be might be
more actual experience at the end of the life. It impacts their beliefs.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Because it is a very different story whether if the person feels that I'm so old and there's something, and I feel everything is so meaningless, and God has abandoned me, He forgot me here. And I think this is the story that we hear in the interviews, that I'm 97 and even God forgot that I exist. But then there is a different story that, oh, I'm 97 and I'm really looking forward to meeting God again. And I'm sure that He is there waiting for me with my parents, and I'm just waiting to disappear. And then there's a tranquility and a serenity, what to look ahead. But then another thing it struck me just today, I've heard something through Jessie from this, that I think you might want to, like when you develop this, that this could be something here that could be transferred to other age groups as well. Because now that I've been thinking COVID stress among young people, it's so similar. And it's so different age group with a different kinds of meaninglessness.
Yeah.
So it was just looking forward what we come up with that.
Yeah. So we're actually with a qualitative study, I don't think we will have the space, to be honest, to still squeeze it in. But in the quantitative study, so if we look at the scale, we also want to have one young adult sample to just see, like, is it really something that is specific to an old age population, or also just to younger people with a lot of stressors? But I think about it differently every time, so I'm very excited to see what will come out. Yeah.
And in the expert reviews, we already have like experts on late life and experts more on younger adults. So we will test the items both in late life and emerging adults.
Just an idea about, we have heard about the connectedness, childness, weariness of life, and you're looking at them as two different phenomena. Maybe they are. Maybe they are not connected. Have you looked at that in some way?
Yeah, at this point, I think we just
They doesn't see what exactly.
They don't have data on that.
No.
Okay, so that's the next step.
Anyway, the idea is there is no kind of, at the moment, no kind of validated deconnectedness scale that we could use. And also, Julie is working with nursing home residents. We will be working with one scale for PhDs. But I will be working, for example, with a different old age population. So probably also our studies will not really be comparable, but we have definitely talked about it a lot, especially the two qualitative studies about existential loneliness and weariness of life that find so similar topics. So that's really like, how can we explain this? But we hope to use some items on deconnectedness also in our longitudinal study on weariness of life to get at least some first ideas.